But yeah, first, I just like for you to introduce yourself, let people know who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Adam Westbrook. I'm right now I'm a PhD student at Boston University in religious studies, and where I focus on studying how different religious groups either get along or don't. So looking at conflict, looking at religion in public spaces, and things of that nature. And I spent a lot of time when I was doing my master's degree working, looking at Israel Palestine and issues in the Middle East and how religion is involved in the conflict there. And spent some time studying there for a summer. And then also I worked for an organization that did conflict mediation with Israeli, Palestinian, and American teens for a year. That also included traveling to the Middle East as well to do that work. So I'm excited to be talking to you, Jalen.
So what really first makes somebody want to be involved in what makes you want to be involved in that type of work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I first actually the reason why I got interested in studying religion was when I was an undergrad. I was an undergrad in upstate New York, and September 11th happened while I was, I think, a sophomore in college. And September 11th was a terrible day for all the reasons that you know already. But it was really interesting to see the reaction that happened on my campus at the time. The college I was going to really was touted itself as a very open college, a very accepting college and all that kind of stuff. And I was really amazed and surprised at the anti-Arab and anti-Muslim sentiment that I saw happen on my campus right after the attacks of September 11th. And it occurred to me at that time that I had no idea. I didn't know anything about Islam at all. In fact, I didn't even know that much about my own tradition that I was raised in. And I thought to myself, boy, this isn't good. In order to really understand each other and be able to work with people who are different, we ought to understand something about the religious traditions of the world. And understand what's going on. So then from there, I got really interested in studying conflict and the role of religion in conflict, and then got really interested in studying religion much broader than just conflict, and just to see how much of a strong force religion is in the world today.
So do you think, especially, I always feel that there's been a strong confusion, and especially even now, in the modern age, post Al-Qaeda, post Al-Qaeda, in this sort of ISIS moment that we're in right now, as it pertains to terrorism, that most people don't have a perspective on actually why things are happening, or why blame is being placed on certain people but not others.
Yeah, no, and I think that that's actually a big part of what I found in my studies of religion is that I wasn't alone when I was a sophomore when I realized that I didn't know very much about religion at all. In fact, most people in our country don't know very much about religion.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a funny thing, and I have a professor that I worked with who wrote a book called Religious Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know and Doesn't. And one of the things he points out in that book is that the United States is one of the most religious countries in the world. We are very, very religious. People feel very strongly about their religion, but they don't know anything about it. So it's a really interesting dynamic where people are super religious, but they don't know very much about kind of some basic tenets about each religious tradition, what holidays are. I mean, everything from just basic practices, like in Orthodox Judaism, for example, pork is not eaten at all. So I think even something as simple as that, people don't know. So I heard of this recent, and here's a good example of this, is there was a university who was trying to court a major donor who was Orthodox Jewish. And when they brought him to campus to kind of give him the spiel and try to court him to donate a lot of money, they provided, I think they had bacon as part of the stuff that they had. I think they had bacon and they had shrimp and some other things. And they ended up really kind of bruising the relationship because the guy was very offended. And had the university known just a little bit more about the religious tradition, they would have been able to not make that mistake. So I think one of the things is that if we don't know very much about religious traditions, not only do we make basic mistakes like that, but we also make mistakes on a much larger level too. Like, for example, before we entered Iraq, a large percentage of the Senate couldn't tell you the difference between a Sunni and a Shia Muslim. So it was completely oblivious to some of the dynamics that existed in the place where it was, that actually resulted in a lot of death and destruction, even more so than I would argue, more so than had they known.
I think I don't really have a strong grasp on how like that engagement or that knowledge is found on a political level. But on a personal level, I feel as though people find themselves afraid to engage with other groups and ask those sort of questions that would like be important.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in our culture, and maybe in many cultures throughout the world, I think religion is a sensitive topic for a lot of people, and I think people deep down are aware that they don't really know that much about religion, and so they're kind of afraid to engage because they're afraid to make a mistake, which I think is perfectly understandable.
Yeah.
There are some organizations, though, that are doing work around interreligious understanding. So there's an organization here in Denver, for example, called the Abrahamic Initiative. So it's an organization that works with Christians, Muslims, and Jews. And they do all sorts of different projects, and they do dialogue, they do social action projects, and then education, where they have kind of speakers and lecturers that come in and do work to kind of help educate the public. So I think there are some groups out there that are starting to do this, and I think the Abrahamic Initiative has been around for, I think, since right around September 11th, actually, so for 16 years or so. But I think there's still a big need for people to get it out there. And one of the things that I look at a lot is thinking about how we can teach about religions in not only in colleges and universities, but also at the high school level as well. So that's when students get to college, they at least have a basic understanding of some of the religious traditions in the world.
So how does one, or more, how did you go about engaging with it? And do you think that, like, in the beginning you were bringing some level of political bias to the religion? Like post 9/11, like trying to dissect this situation?
Yeah, I think initially I was really interested in what would cause a group of people to hijack planes and fly them into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. That's a pretty extreme kind of act, right? Yeah. How much did religion play in that? I was really curious as to, because you heard afterwards, there were a lot of people saying this isn't about religion, this is a political thing, this has nothing to do with what real Islam is. And I think that there's some truth in that. This is not what most Muslims do. Yeah. This is not what most Muslims feel. But I think it's also important to look at what religion does and what it has the potential to do, and how that can play itself out. So, like, I was more interested in the questions. You asked if I had a political bias. I was really curious. I was like, this is a wild thing that just happened. How do we make sense of it? What causes this to happen? And one of the things that I found is that in all sorts of different religious traditions, you see people doing extreme acts like this. So in other words, this wasn't unique to Islam. Yeah. But you have people in Judaism, you have people in Christianity, you have, for example, you have people who have assassinated abortion doctors, Christians, very strong Christians who've done that. You have Jewish extremists in Israel who will go to the Palestinian territories and commit a massive act of violence because of the way that because they feel like their land is God-given to the Jewish people. So what I'm saying is, like, there are these extreme acts that happen in all different religious traditions. I found that very interesting.
I think a lot of it is, so religion, I feel like religion is very much built out of a group. Like, it's very much, you have a group of people that are either racially together, culturally together, of one country, and they all ascribe to a like certain ideology,
Sure.
and what'll happen is you'll have people that will take that ideology to an extreme level, and and it'll get away from what like the initial goals are. And that's sort of how we get further to extremism.
I think that's up for debate. To be honest, I think it's hard. In the study of religion, we really want to dissect and look at kind of what the claims are in different religious traditions. And I think from my perspective, it's difficult to get down to some sort of core about what that like you said, you use the word initial purpose or initial goals of the religious tradition. I think it's really hard to know what those initial goals are. And because of that, it's really hard to say, from an academic standpoint, who has it right and who has it wrong. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Kind of.
It does, but what I mean more like with that is, I think more of these like extremist actions, more of the, because like I don't really know Judaism or like what's the correct way to say it, like
Islam?
Yeah,
Okay.
Islam.
Yeah.
I don't really know like their tenets as well.
Sure.
But I know there's like strong similarities through the three. I know
Sure.
Christianity well. And one thing it talks about is like the idea of murder being wrong, but still people that ascribe to like being a Christian have made acts that go against like the overall like rules.
Well, I think murder is a great example. I think because in at least in Christianity, there's a long tradition of what's called just war theory, or in other words, basically when violence is justified. Same thing in Islam. There are several different ways of understanding that in each different religious tradition. But here's one way that Osama bin Laden justified what happened on September 11th. He said, this is about self-defense. And this is about, because in Islam, there's, at least even in his brand of Islam, there was this idea that you're not supposed to kill it's called non-combatants, basically people who are not part of the enemy, people who are not part of the enemy group. But he justified it by saying that all U.S. citizens pay taxes that go to support the military that then does terrible things abroad. And particularly to Muslim countries throughout the world. Yeah. And so Osama bin Laden was saying this is an act of defense.
So he more or less restructured the argument?
Yeah.
Like into his own direction.
And he still made it work within the system of Islam that he was working with.
Yeah.
So I think, I think you're right. There is rules against murder in all these different traditions, but there are also rules that justify violence as well. And so that's where the interesting stuff is, and that's where it gets a little sticky. That's one of the most interesting things about studying religion is you realize that often these actors who do things like the extremism that we were just talking about, they're very thoughtful about the way that they're justifying what they're doing and how they're making sense of it. So it gets tricky. It gets very tricky.
So how do you think, so as a society, how do you think one engages with not trying to persecute a certain group that they don't like understand? Like, how do you gain the knowledge to be able to like not look at another group as being overall evil, just understanding that each group has a number of bad actors in it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I can only really speak from my experience. One of the things that I found, I mentioned a minute ago that I worked with an organization that does conflict mediation between Israelis, Palestinians, and Americans. And one of the things that I found with that is one group always has an idea about what the other group is. In other words, if I'm a Palestinian Muslim, I have this idea of what a Jewish Israeli is. and they're evil and they're persecuting me and they're doing these things, and that you're able to keep that narrative about that other group until you meet them.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found, and I don't want to paint the picture too bright because it's not like this solves all the problems.
Yeah.
But you asked, like, how do you break down some of those narratives? Is, I think, actually meeting people who are different than you and engaging with them and having real honest conversation with them about it. Building relationships with them. I found this is the same thing with the Abrahamic Initiative, the organization I was a part of for a little while. They're focused on getting physically in the same place with people who are different, like sitting down, having a direct conversation, learning from each other, disagreeing at times, standing firm in their beliefs and who they are. But there's something that happens when you actually meet the other.
Yeah.
And it complicates the idea of them that you have, because you're like, all of a sudden, man, this person isn't as much of a persecutor as I thought they were. Actually, they have a family with kids and they're a good dad or a good mom.
Yeah.
And I treat my kids in a similar way, or I treat my kids differently, but I get the love that exists there.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And
Yeah.
it makes it harder to keep you as the persecutor, enemy, evil person, evildoer. So I think that's one, like I said, I don't think that's something that is going to end persecution or end violence between different groups, but I think it's a step. And one of the things that I'm worried about, as I'm seeing in cultures today, people are doing less and less of that interaction with people who are different than them. We see this in our political conversation. We see this, you hear about the echo chambers of Facebook where you're only friends with people who think and look like you and act like you. And so I'm a little worried about people moving further and further apart because they're interacting with people who are different than them much less than we used to.
So, like, and what I've seen as a media major, so, like, I study social media pretty often, and in really trying to dissect what, at least the ones I know the best are Facebook and Instagram.
Yeah.
And Instagram especially wants you to sort of stay in a specific category and be surrounded by people and content that reflects your values,
Right.
and not ever really be questioned. I think that's a lot, that's very far of what we're getting into in the internet age, where people are having values either like that they've like sort of earned over time, like just through life, or different ones that they've been taught and brought up with. And that's like manifesting itself in how they act in social media, and they're surrounding themselves with it. And instead of like engaging with other groups, like they're just furthering themselves.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. It seems that way. It seems like that's the way things are going right now. And I'll be honest too, it's not easy to interact with people who are different.
Yeah.
Who act differently than you do, where the norms are different, maybe the means of communication looks different. So what I'm proposing about meeting the other and engaging with the other, I don't mean to say that that's a very easy thing to do. It's definitely not, especially if you get really honest about your different perspectives and different ways of being. It's a challenging thing, which is why I think it's much easier for people to kind of continue to get further entrenched in their own group,
Yep.
And like you were saying, like, I only want to be around people who have the values that I do. I don't want to be challenged. I don't want to be pushed. I want to be in my comfortable world where everybody thinks and acts like me, and I know how to act.
Yep.
And I think it's a human thing. We like when we can predict things. We don't like to be thrown off guard. And when we're interacting with somebody who's really different than us, chances are you're going to be thrown off guard at least a few times in that process.
I think a lot of it is sort of politics and culture have started to influence people's perspectives on other groups of religion, because it's like we don't have that initial information, so it's given to us by separate groups that aren't really entrenched in it.
Yeah.
and that's what builds how we feel. I feel like a lot of the reason why, like even prior to 9/11, there's been a different perspective. Like we've had a certain perspective either on Jews or on Muslims. Is it's more politically given than actually a result of like those groups.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think on that note, I was when you started talking, I was thinking about the reaction that I described on my college campus after September 11th. And in some ways, I can't blame people for having the reaction they did.
Yeah.
Because all they know at that point, all they knew about Islam was that this group of this religious group flew planes in and were responsible for killing almost 3,000 people.
Yeah.
That's messed up. I don't want that group to be around me because like you said, they have no other information to complicate that kind of narrative. Whereas, for example, when a Christian shoots an abortion doctor, most people in the United States have enough information about Christianity to know that might have just been an extremist in the group, and that person doesn't represent the entire group of Christians in the country. So I think those two responses show us that if you have some information about these different religious groups, you're able to understand an extremist event like that happens in a way that doesn't paint the whole group as extremists. Does that make sense?
I definitely get that. I think the big thing is I feel as though like we're in a really good time to have these discussions.
Yeah.
Like I've seen, I can't think of the name of the documentary, but basically there's this documentary where they take three or four Jewish kids and like three like Muslim kids, both like in Israel and Palestine, and have them interact with each other and like talk and like hang out and have fun and just be children.
Yeah.
And it comes from a place that's so innocent, where like a lot of their values aren't necessarily theirs, and like this was I think the original documentary was shot in the 90s, and most of these kids are like grown adults
now.
With like jobs, and most of them live in America now instead of like Israel or Palestine, and like their perspectives on things just based off of that one experience are way different. It's really like reshaped them.
It's exciting. It's hopeful.
I think the big thing is just knowing how not to. I think it's important to stay calm, even when you feel a certain type of way.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, and I think because people aren't used to feeling that sense of discomfort that we were talking about before, that I think some folks are more easily, that freaks them out more than if they were used to being in situations kind of throughout their lives where they were uncomfortable interacting with people who are different, interacting with so-called enemies, and stuff like that. Whereas I think this is related. I think that we don't have a good practice around how to interact with people who are different and how to maintain our own discomfort in that moment. I think you're hitting on that. I think that's a really, really important piece, is how do we teach people to sit in their discomfort a little bit and not freak out. Yeah. You know?
I think a lot of it in my sort of way is like, I think the bigger engagement is, I think, what applies to understanding the Israel-Palestine conversation can also apply to understanding like American politics, can also apply to like racism and all these different like subject matters.
Yeah.
One thing I do want to get into, and this is a like sort of current development, and with everything else that's like happening around the world, I think it's gotten a little glossed over in certain aspects, is the whole understanding the weight of our current president's like approval.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. In what sense?
In the sense that, is it more important when, like, does another country really understand the difference between America believes something or like Donald Trump believes something, and the word of this one man reflects us?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how much weight does that carry?
That's a great question. I think that's a problem with global politics around the world.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, when we think of North Korea, we think of Kim Jong-un, who's the leader of North Korea, and we assume that all the people are behind him, kind of thing. So we kind of group the whole thing together. Same thing with Iran. Iran is another kind of boogeyman.
Yeah.
So we think of the leadership, and we kind of assume the whole country is a threat. When really Iran, and I know more about Iran than I do about North Korea, but in Iran, there's actually, politically, it's very, very mixed, especially among young people. Young people are very, very critical of the current administration in Iran. And so it's kind of a similar dynamic that we see in some parts of the United States, where actually a good portion of the population completely disagrees with the person who's in the White House.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think it's a challenge for all of us, especially as we start hearing things about these other countries, to be like, oh, Iran is going to do this and North Korea is going to do this, is for us to challenge ourselves to really think, like, when we say those words, who are we talking about? And is it, and it's probably the case where most people, or a lot of people, don't feel that same way as their leader does, because in our country it's the same thing, you know.
No matter which side it is, it's sort of more like there's a large portion of the country that's not being reflected, like, through the current leader, and especially in this climate that we are in, where everybody's so far left or far right.
Sure.
At least in the like modern sort of political perspective, it's really hard to be in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas we can understand the idea that like what Trump says isn't what we believe, and reflecting that on other places,
Mm-hmm.
on being that this is what their leader says or thinks or does,
Mm-hmm.
but this isn't what every citizen thinks.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Now it does get complicated, because what the leader says also matters, and Donald Trump does represent the people of the United States, whether we like him or not. And so you asked the question about, like, how much weight does what his words carry? And I would say he's the president of the United States. No matter who's in that office, that carries a lot of weight, whatever he says, which I think for some people, they're really excited about that. And for some people, they're very concerned about that. You know, for the people who disagree with him, I think they're very concerned that he doesn't recognize the power of his words, or he's a little bit of a loose cannon.
Yeah.
As far as what he says and when he says it. You know, they refer to his Twitter feed and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that his words do have a lot of power.
So what's been the and like I've heard it from different perspectives, but like what was it that he said recently about like Israel Palestine?
Yeah, so last week he announced that the United States is going to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Which there's a long story to be told there about what that, why that hasn't been the case in the past. But the short of it is that Jerusalem has always been a contested city for the Israelis and the Palestinians. It was actually split when Israel became a nation in 1948.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually split between the west side and the east side, and Israel only controlled the west side, and the Palestinians and the Arabs controlled the East Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
Then in 1967, there was a war that broke out where Israel occupied the east side of Jerusalem as well.
Mm-hmm.
Many nations throughout the world didn't recognize that occupation as a legitimate legal thing.
Yeah.
And UN Resolution 242 basically was passed unanimously by the UN or close to unanimously by the UN, and it said that basically Israel would have to give up the territories that it gained in that last war, and that they can only hold on to them for kind of security purposes until things calm down, and they would have to give it up. And they haven't for a number of different reasons since 1967. And so I say all that backstory to say that when, I give all that backstory to say that since 1967 in particular, many countries throughout the world have not recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel because it's been contested, and because the UN has basically said it's not legitimate that Israel controls the whole thing. So, for example, the United States has had its embassy in Tel Aviv, which is in kind of the northwest part of the country, as a way, and many other countries have done the same thing, as a way of saying,
like
we recognize
acknowledging this area and acknowledging Israel as a country,
right,
but not acknowledging Jerusalem as the capital.
Exactly. And then in 1990, I think it was 1995, the U.S. Congress passed a law that actually did recognize Jerusalem as the capital, but there was a caveat in that law that said that the president has the right to delay this every 6 months if he wants to. And every president since 1995, every 6 months has delayed actually making that acknowledgement. Largely because I think the previous presidents have understood that to do that would really disrupt any semblance of a peace process. And so Donald Trump has taken the other direction and said, I'm not going to sign that waiver, and I'm going to acknowledge
the results of that disruption that we've been.
Yeah. And we're seeing a few of those results. There's violence happening. We're seeing it between the Gaza Strip, which is one of the Palestinian territories, and Israel. There's exchange of rockets going back and forth over the last several days.
Is it more just like blind threats? Just like, are they aiming at anything, or are they just trying to show force?
They're aiming at Israel. So people in Gaza are aiming rockets at Israel. In some ways, it doesn't matter where they land. But the point is that they're pushing back against this. So, of course, what that has provoked is it's provoked Israel to give a counter response. So there's been violence from Israel into the Gaza Strip as well. So we've seen this. There's going to be this back and forth tit for tat that happens between in that area. We've also seen on Friday there were protests all over the world, from Indonesia to Jordan to Malaysia to lots of different countries all around the world protesting this decision on Friday. We also have seen, just today, about an hour ago, I saw an article that said that China has called for an independent Palestinian state that recognizes Jerusalem as its capital. So that's kind of a big move, because it's a direct counter to what the United States just did. The United States says, no, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, and then China comes and says, no, Jerusalem is going to be the capital of Palestine. And so we're seeing also that a fight between the United States and China is being played out in the Middle East.
Sort of in the similar way that it's like, sort of like the Korean front. Like the Korean War was very much a play out of us versus Russia.
Right. Yeah,
but
exactly.
We're not there, but we're very much like pushing the two sides.
That's right.
Is it? And this is sort of a thought that just comes to me in the sense of like looking at how the map has slowly moved in the favor, like the map for like Israel Palestine has moved in the favor of one side over the other, in a state of like, it's easy to look at it and be like, it's very much might makes right. Like Israel has won the wars. Israel has made claimants over the territory and has the like manpower and the enforcement to be able to make those claims and back them up without anybody else's intervention. Yeah. And I think a lot of people, we're very much in a state of trying to protect Palestine, or like the Palestinians, without like it completely just devolving into a mass genocide at a certain point.
Well, I would disagree a little bit on what you're saying about how Israel has kind of done it on its own. I think that they've largely done it on their own. They win these wars, etc. But no country is on an island. It's always supported by other countries in different kinds of ways. And the United States has been a very big supporter of Israel. $3 billion a year. Billion or million? I can't remember. I think it's $3 billion a year go to Israel for their military support from the United States. So it's quite a bit. So they have support from us.
And how long has that been going on?
Decades. Yeah, decades. Basically, actually, the United States was one of the first countries to recognize Israel in 1948. I've heard that they recognized them 12 minutes after the Israelis recognized it. So it was like we've been very much supportive. The United States has been very much supportive of Israel up and from the get-go. So I've heard people say this claim of Jerusalem being the capital of Israel that Trump said just basically is being honest about our position, about the United States position forever, where previously we had really been supporting Israel, but coming out and saying something different politically. I don't know if that's, I think you can argue that point back and forth, but yeah, I just want to point out that I think countries they're always working with each other, and they're getting support from elsewhere as well. So the claim that they've won the wars, they've done it on their own, they deserve it, etc. It's not exactly as simple as that.
More like I think I'm trying to, because I feel like I have a lot of information, but I'm trying to avoid making assumptions that aren't completely valid, but are things that have like come into my mind. Like I look at I've seen how the map is very much Israel everywhere, and it's only slowly, progressively become more so, where you have like Palestine slowly becoming a smaller presence, at least on the political front.
Sure.
Do you think so? Are there Israelis that are Muslim?
Yes. So that's kind of one of the complicated things about this is the different identities. So Israeli is a national identity, in the same way that American is a national identity. So in the United States, we have Jewish Americans, we have Christian Americans, we have Muslim Americans, Hindu Americans, et cetera, et cetera. In Israel, you have that as well. So you can be Muslim and Israeli. You can be Christian and Israeli. You can be Jewish and Israeli. So that's the national thing. Where it gets a little complicated is when Israel was founded in 1948, it founded itself as a Jewish state. So it assumed that it was always going to have a Jewish majority in the country. That's up for debate right now, because right now about 25% of their population is not Jewish. 25% of their voting population is not Jewish. And demographics and birth rates could shift that quite a bit in just one generation. So I don't know what the exact numbers are, but non-Jewish Israelis are having kids at a significantly higher rate than Jewish Israelis are. So a generation from now, the minority looks like 25% right now. A generation from now, it could look like 40%. And now we're talking a different kind of dynamic, because the Jewishness of the Jewish state is actually becoming less so over time.
Okay, so on an internal level, let's say, like, just tossing around hypotheticals.
Yeah.
Let's say the shift becomes less of like Jewish being like the majority. It's like, even as a majority, it's less so of the majority. What do you think happens with the conflict? Like, if we're still in this constant stalemate that we're at.
Yeah. Boy, that's a great question. I have no idea what is going to happen, but I could talk a little bit about what some conflicts will be. The larger the majority, the larger the minority becomes, the more powerful they get in a democracy.
Yeah.
The more represented they are.
Yeah.
The more they get to sway different policies, procedures, things like that. So if you think about it, let's say 40% of the population is Muslim in 25 years. If politically that group can get together and basically come up with a platform, they can represent almost half of parliament.
Yeah.
And then they could pass laws that don't really that are less about maintaining the Jewishness of the Jewish state.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Israel really has a question that they have to ask themselves to say, do we want to be a democracy or do we want to be a Jewish state? Because the way that the demographics are going right now, they're not going to be able to do both in the next 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
So this is why one of the solutions, quote unquote solutions that have come up is this idea of the two-state solution. So you create an official state of Palestine, which is a non-Jewish state. So you have Muslims and Christians moving and living in Palestine, and you have Israel as a Jewish state, and you basically maintain a majority of Israelis are going to be Jewish. So you do that. It's kind of like what happened with India and Pakistan in the 1940s when that was created there. The idea was that India would remain a Hindu majority state and Pakistan would be a Muslim majority state. And so when the two countries were created, you saw this huge migration of people moving to their countries.
Like
wherever their
sides,
groups.
basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is one of the leading ideas of what we should do about Israel-Palestine. Will it work? I have no freaking clue. I have no idea. But it's one idea that allows Israel to maintain itself as a Jewish state and a democracy, and it gives safety and security to the Palestinians and self-determination to the Palestinians about how they want to have their state be. I don't know what's going to happen.
It's very interesting because I think it shows a lot of our separation from the situation, but it's often America will sit in a state that's a little both. We're very involved, we're very hands off.
Yeah.
And it depends on who you ask.
Yeah.
Because if you ask most people, they don't know how involved we are in this conflict. Like they, on a personal level, aren't. But yeah.
Yeah. And I would say the most obvious, I mean, there are a few really obvious ways that we're involved. Israel is a very strong partner of the U.S. We have really good relationships with Israel right now. We give a lot of support, financial support to Israel. We have a lot of people in our country who care deeply about the Israel-Palestine issue. So that's why it will come up in political conversation, in the national conversation, is because, not just Jewish groups, but also Muslim groups, Christian groups. Remember that part of the Middle East is so charged with the religiosity of these three great traditions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. So in some ways, almost everybody throughout the world, not everybody, but many people throughout the world feel a sense of connection to this place and a sense of stock. Like if I'm Jewish, I feel like maybe I have part ownership in what happens there. Like that city actually means something. If I'm Christian, that city actually means something. If I'm Muslim, that city actually means something directly to me. So this is why it's so challenging in a lot of ways. Because there's, if there are 7 billion people in the world right now, you probably have 8 billion different opinions about what's going on there and what should happen.
Yeah, I think, okay, so one thing I see tossed around a lot, and I don't know how true this is, but I know very much during the reign of like the Ottoman Empire, you have Christians, you have Muslims, you have Jews, all interacting together, not really like under a conflict. You have the Ottoman Empire, which isn't like on a political level doesn't ascribe to just one specific like religious ideology.
Well, it was a Muslim empire.
Uh-huh.
It was, the Ottomans were Muslims.
Okay.
But they had a particular system that allowed for different groups to operate as separate groups. In other words, they didn't create their empire and said everybody needs to convert to Islam. It was kind of the opposite. They said, we're going to leave space and allow people to interact this way. Now, I don't want to paint the picture like it was all peachy and keen and everything was great, because there were certain additional taxes that people who weren't who weren't Muslim had to pay. There were certain kinds of, some would argue they were still seen as second-class citizens where they weren't Muslim. But one thing to take away is that they didn't require that everybody was the same in the Ottoman Empire, which I think is significant. I think today we're seeing strides to just get rid of people who are different. Yeah. We're seeing that in the rise of white nationalism that's happening in the United States right now. The Charlottesville event that happened just a few months ago. You see people who really want to push out those who they see as outside of their group. There was a chant at the Charlottesville event, "Jews will not replace us." So I think that's really significant. So who are the us? Who is the us that they're talking about? Probably white non-Jews at least, but probably white Christians. So they're making a statement about who belongs here and who doesn't. So you're seeing that happen here. You're seeing it happen in Poland. You're seeing it happen in France and the UK. You're seeing it happen all over the world right now. So that's why I think it's interesting to look at the Ottoman Empire and say, well, how did they do it? How did they live with a bunch of different groups and figure out a way to do it for 500 years with very little conflict,
What I try to understand is because I know it wasn't the perfect situation, but it's better than what we're kind of working with right now, where it
was less violent probably in a lot of ways. Yeah. Better, I don't know. It's tough. It's tough to say. We have these ideals in democracy today where everybody's equal. Everybody has equal respect, dignity, etc. Where I think in the Ottoman Empire that idea wasn't there. So these things are kind of trade-offs. I'm also not saying that the only two options are what we have today or the Ottoman Empire. I'm actually interested in exploring a third or fourth or fifth option to say that the times are different than they were during the Ottoman period. But that doesn't mean what that means is there are ways to explore how we can still live without being violent to different groups and allow different groups to still exist, coexist together. Yeah.
Okay, so what really do you want people to take away from this conversation?
I think one of the things in my experience and in my studies that has struck me is that I think we are moving into this period where we're very uncomfortable with interacting with people who are different than us. And I just want to challenge people to try to put themselves in situations where they're interacting with people who are different than them, whether that's racially different, whether that's social class difference, whether that's religious difference, whether that's gender, sexual orientation, could be anything, nationality, culturally. And when you do, you will feel uncomfortable sometimes. It's a human reaction that you're going to feel uncomfortable. But I want to challenge people to go through that discomfort, and it will get less comfortable, and try to understand where somebody else is coming from and what they're all about. I think that meeting, the actual engagement, that honest engagement, can start to move us in a direction where we can figure some of this stuff out. Yeah.
One thing I've seen, and this is something I really want to do, my personal perspective, I have a neighbor that, I've known him for years now. He's I think he's lived in, he moved in the neighborhood after we did. And I've known him since I was probably 16, 17. And we both sit on two opposite sides on the political spectrum.
Sure.
But we're still friends.
Yeah. That's possible.
I know when I go back home, like I'm gonna talk to him, I'm gonna peg at him, we're gonna joke.
Yeah.
And we've had like serious conversations about politics and where we stand, and it's been, I know, especially being here where a lot of people here like kind of share like my feelings
Sure.
ideologically. I enjoy talking to him because I want to see how he feels about us,
Yeah.
because I know how my group feels about their group.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
I think having that level of engagement really helps,
Mm-hmm.
because then I don't look at I try to look at every other person on whatever different side it is, where it's socioeconomically, religiously, just like any like internal feelings I might have about them. Try to look at them like I would look at somebody that I already know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes it tougher for you to hate them because you know somebody who's actually a pretty decent human being who just happens to really disagree with what you feel like. Absolutely. And that's, like we were saying, like that's becoming less and less frequent, where people have those kinds of relationships like you do with your neighbor, where you're actually friends with somebody who really thinks differently than you.
Yeah.
But it's very possible, and it's actually, I think it's necessary and so important for a society to continue to move on and not break, to have those kinds of relationships. That's the glue, I think, that holds societies together. So, yeah.
Well, was there anything you want to add before like we wrap this up?
I don't think so. I just want to say thanks for inviting me to do this. This was really fun, and yeah.
I did enjoy like the class conversation, and I really wanted to carry it forward, and I like documenting things.
Yeah.
I'm more of the person of the mindset. I would rather have these type of conversations, bring people in, help them understand, and then like apply dialogue to it and see what happens, rather than like write a paper.
Yeah. I encourage you to do that, and to work with folks to find like a platform to actually expose this out there to people, because I think people would love this kind of thing.
Yeah.
They would love listening to it. Yeah. Well, thanks.
Cool. It was a pleasure talking to
Awesome.
you.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Jalen. I appreciate it.
No problem. But yeah, no.